Shortly after noon, when this crucial phase of the Battle of Midway ended, 3 Japanese carriers were in a sinking condition, and the American carrier force was intact. But Enterprise had lost 14 out of 37 dive bombers, 10 out of 14 torpedo bombers, and 1 Wildcat. Hornet had lost all her torpedo bombers and 11 or 12 Wildcats. Yorktown had lost all but 1 of her torpedo bombers, 2 dive bombers, and 3 Wildcats. This was no excessive price for what had been accomplished, but it was a frightful blow to the carrier air groups, whose aviators had given everything they had. Admiral Nagumo, when he saw that he would have to abandon Akagi, transferred the tactical command of the striking force to Rear Admiral Abe, commanding his cruiser and battleship screen. Abe had 1 undamaged carrier with a full air group left, and from scout plane contacts he gathered that Fletcher had no more than 2 carriers, possibly but 1. If so, she or they must already have expended most of their planes. At 8:47, Nagumo radioed Yamamoto, sighted enemy composed of 1 carrier, 5 cruisers, and 6 destroyers at position bearing 10° 240 miles from Midway. We are heading for it. That carrier was Yorktown, and Abe had placed the Indian sign on her at 10:50. He passed the word to Admiral Yamaguchi and Hiryu, "Attack the enemy carrier," and Hiryu blinked back. "All our planes are taking off now." Launching of the first attack group, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, was completed by 11. The second attack group of 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters took off at 13:31. 2 reconnaissance planes from cruiser Chikuma, which had located Admiral Fletcher's force, were ordered to lead the dive bombers to it. Help was coming too for the hard-pressed striking force. Precisely at noon, 2 heartening messages reached Nagumo, who by then had shifted his flag to Nagara and taken back the tactical command. The air commander of Hiryu's attack group radioed, "We are bombing the enemy carrier." Admiral Kondo, commander-in-chief of the Second Fleet that had been supporting the occupation force to the southwestward, radioed that he was bringing his powerful force of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers up north at 28 knots in support. And 20 minutes later, Yamamoto ordered carriers Ryujo and Junyo, of the force that had attacked Dutch Harbour, to come south and join Hiryu. At the same time, the Aleutian screening force was ordered to rendezvous with Yamamoto at the 9th of June 5 in preparation for a fleet action. Things were beginning to look up for the enemy. The samurai clans were gathering, and their swords were sharp. By noon, Yorktown had a combat air patrol of 12 Wildcats in the air, and was refueling the patrol just relieved, as well as 3 others that had returned from the strike on Nagumo's force. Leslie's dive bombers that had sunk Soryu were orbiting ready to land, when Yorktown's radar reported 30 to 40 planes approaching from the WSW 40 miles out. The returning victors were waved away, fuel lines were drained and filled with CO2, combat air patrol was sent out to intercept, Yorktown bent on 30.5 knots, and manoeuvred abruptly. It was now a few minutes before noon. "The attack is coming in, sir," said Admiral Fletcher's aide. Frank Jack, bending over a chart to figure out his next move, merely looked up a minute and said, "Well, I have got on my tin hat. I can't do anything else now." The Wildcat pilots of the Combat Air Patrol, part of Thach's Fighting 3, did themselves proud, shooting down or sending home minus their bombs over half of the 18 Vals that were approaching. But 8 got through. Cruisers Astoria and Portland and the destroyers between them knocked down 2. The other 6 made 3 hits, of which 2 were serious. From one Val, as it disintegrated under anti-aircraft fire, a bomb tumbled out on Yorktown's flight deck. Its explosion terminated many men, started fires below, and spread black smoke over the ship. The officer of the hangar deck, Lieutenant A.C. Emerson, released the sprinkler system and water curtains, which quickly extinguished the fires. The next explosive came in from the port side and exploded in the smokestack, firing the soot and paint, which flaked off and started fires elsewhere, ruptured the uptakes from 3 boilers, disabled 2 of them, and snuffed out fires in 5 out of 6 boilers. Her speed dropped to 6 knots, and by 12:20, 20 minutes after the hit, to 0. A third explosive exploded on the 4th deck, starting a fire in a rag stowage compartment adjacent to the forward gasoline tanks and magazines. Her magazines were promptly flooded, and carbon dioxide prevented the gas from exploding. As the fire on the island had knocked out the ship's radar, rendering flag plot and communications untenable, Admiral Fletcher shifted his flag to cruiser Astoria. At about 13:15, when the transfer was completed, he directed cruiser Portland to take the carrier in tow. She never passed the tow line because Yorktown's damage control parties worked to such good purpose that by 13:44 boilers were back on the line. Down came her breakdown flag, blue St. Andrew's cross on yellow field, and to everyone's joy she began turning up 18 to 20 knots. But that was not enough. She was beginning to refuel fighter planes when a cruiser's radar picked up Hiryu's second attack wave, distant 40 miles, and within an hour this gallant carrier was a useless derelict. Spruance, who had seen the smoke of the dive bombings from over the horizon, had already detached cruisers Pensacola and Vincennes and destroyers Benham and Balch from his force to augment Fletcher's. They were cruising in disposition Victor 1 mile out, so disposed as to afford the carrier ample anti-aircraft protection on her vulnerable bows and quarters. But they were not enough. Yorktown had time to launch 8 Wildcats with an average of only 23 gallons in each tank, which joined the 4 planes already in the air in an attempt to intercept. They were unable to cope with the 10 fast Japanese torpedo bombers and 6 escorting Zeeks, which were visible at 9 miles distance, approaching from the westward at 7,000 feet. The time was 14:30. Anti-aircraft fire was not opened immediately because of recognition difficulties, but after seeing a Wildcat shoot down a Zeke, all the task force guns, large and small, gave tongue. Yorktown turned hard left, the cruisers keeping station as best they could. This placed Portland a little ahead of Yorktown on her port bow, and Astoria another ship's length or 2 farther ahead, on the carrier's starboard bow. Pensacola and Vincennes were on her quarters. The torpedo planes separated to attack from 4 different angles at masthead height or lower. When they closed to 3,000 yards, the heavy cruisers tried tactics that their divisional commander, Poco Smith, had worked out. With their main batteries, their 5-inch 25S and everything that would bear, they fired right into the sea across the plane's path. The shells exploded on impact, sending up a veritable Niagara of water ahead of each group of planes. It seemed impossible that any winged craft could penetrate the shimmering, watery curtains, but 4 Kates did and released torpedoes within 500 yards of the now slowly moving carrier. One of their pilots, on his pull-out, passed so close aboard that he could be seen shaking his fist. At about 14:42, Yorktown dodged 2 torpedoes, but 2 others hit and exploded, breaching most of the fuel tanks on her port side, jamming the rudder, severing all power connections and causing an immediate list of 17 degrees, which increased to about 26 degrees in the next 20 minutes. Captain Buckmaster advised by his damage control officer that counter-flooding was impossible without power, and that their watertight integrity had been only half restored by the repairs at Pearl, feared the Yorktown was about to capsize. A few minutes before 15, he ordered abandon ship. 4 destroyers closed to take off the crew or pick them up from the water. The others screened, expecting a 3rd air attack. The sea was smooth, and although the water was much colder than that of the Coral Sea, it is believed that nobody drowned. Floating bluejackets amused each other by calling, "Taxi! Taxi!" and thumbing imaginary rides at drifting debris. Strains of the beer barrage polka floated from one raft full of officers and men. Admiral Fletcher, estimating before the first attack on Yorktown that 1 enemy carrier was intact, had had the foresight to send out a search mission of 10 scout bombers commanded by Lieutenant Wallace C. Short. After searching far and wide for over 3 hours, they were on their way back to Yorktown, happily ignorant of her disaster, when at 14:45 pilot Samuel Adams made what his commanding officer stoutly maintains to have been the best, clearest, and most accurate carrier-plane contact report of the entire war. He saw Hiryu, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 4 destroyers steaming north, about 110 miles W by N of where Yorktown then was. A few minutes later, Yorktown was abandoned, but on the basis of Lieutenant Adams's report, she was amply avenged. At 15:30, as Admiral Spruance ordered, Enterprise turned into the wind and launched an attack mission of 24 SBDs, 10 of them refugees from Yorktown, and all veterans of the morning attack on the other 3 carriers. No fighter escort was provided, as all surviving Wildcats were needed for combat air patrol. The dive bombers, led by the redoubtable Gallagher, jumped Hiryu and her attendant cruisers at 17. The same dive-bombing tactics that had proved successful in the morning were employed. Hiryu, making 30 knots, received 4 direct hits, of which one blew off the forward elevator platform so that it crashed against the island, knocking out all facilities there. The others started uncontrollable fires. Among those who went down with her was the division commander, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, an outstanding flag officer who, it is said, was slated to be Yamamoto's successor. Enterprise and Yorktown lost 3 more SBDs with their crews in this attack. Within an hour, the already defeated Japanese striking force was attacked by a number of flying fortresses from Molokai and Midway, but the usual ill fortune attended them. Every one of their bombs missed. One fort strafed Hiryu, already on fire but steaming, knocked out an anti-aircraft gun and terminated several men. This was the only damage which B-17S inflicted on the enemy in the Battle of Midway, despite their valiant efforts to supplement the deadly work of the carrier planes. From Midway, Major Benjamin W. Norris, USMC, who had succeeded Major Henderson as commander of the decimated Marine Bomber Squadron, took off at 19 with the squadron's few operational planes, 5 Vindicators and 6 SBDs, to make a night attack on the burning Hiryu. They failed to find her, and Major Norris never returned. Fire gradually ate into Hiryu's vitals. All hands, including the Emperor's portrait, were ordered to abandon ship at 3:15 June 5th by Captain Kaku, who stayed on board. At 5:10, 2 destroyers tried to sink her with torpedoes. She floated, burning fiercely until 9. And when she went down, Nagumo had lost the last of his 4 fleet carriers. Now let us see what was happening on board combined fleet flagship Yamato, several hundred miles to the rear. Messages from Nagumo, announcing the hits on 3 carriers, aroused the utmost consternation, recalled Yamamoto's yeoman. But news of the first attack on Yorktown cheered the admiral considerably. He had lost 3 of his 4 big carriers, but if, as Nagumo informed him, the enemy had never had but 1 carrier, he now had none, and in any case Yamamoto had overwhelming gunfire superiority. Acting promptly, he broke radio silence at 12:20 June 4th to order the Aleutian screening group and Kondo's 2nd Fleet to join his main body by noon next day, while the Midway occupation force retired temporarily to the northwestward. No sooner was this order given than both Yamamoto and Nagumo received for the first time an accurate statement of the United States Task Force from 2 different sources, Hiryu's returning aviators, who had seen all 3 carriers, and an American pilot rescued from the water, who had the information extorted from him. At 13:30, as we have seen, Hiryu launched her 2nd attack on Yorktown, and at 17, Hiryu in turn was knocked out. "The game is up," thought everybody on Yamato's bridge, recalled the loquacious yeoman. The members of the staff, their mouths tight shut, looked at one another in indescribable emptiness, cheerlessness, and chagrin. Yamamoto could only say, "Is gender all right?" He was the one officer essential to recovery of air power. He had been saved when Akagi was abandoned. As Yamamoto hastened with his main body to support the decimated striking force, he exchanged an interesting series of dispatches with Nagumo. At 19:15, he radioed a stout-hearted message to all division and force commanders. 1. The enemy fleet, which has practically been destroyed, is retiring to the east. 2. Combined fleet units in the vicinity are preparing to pursue the remnants and at the same time to occupy Midway. 3. The main body is scheduled to reach latitude 32°10 north, longitude 175°43 east, on course 90 degrees, speed 20 knots by midnight. 4. The mobile force, occupation force and advance force will immediately contact and attack the enemy. Nagumo had no stomach for these heroics. Midway was no fun like Pearl Harbor and Trincomalee. On the strength of a highly inaccurate sighting report from one of Chikuma's planes, which confirmed his own fears, he radioed to Yamamoto at 21:30. The total strength of the enemy is 5 carriers, 6 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. These are steaming westward. We are offering protection to Hiryu and retiring to the northwest at 18 knots. And again, at 2250. There still exist 4 enemy carrier, 6 cruisers, and 16 destroyers. These are steaming westward. None of our carriers are operational. Yamamoto promptly answered these faint-hearted messages by ordering Kondo, already hastening northeastward, to relieve Nagumo, who was peremptorily told to take charge of the sinking carriers and such ships as were standing by them. Kondo at 2340 ordered all ships under him to prepare for a night engagement, but before the dispositions had been made, the commander-in-chief changed his mind. As more intelligence came in, showing that his 4 splendid carriers were sunk or burning derelicts, and that 2 American carriers were probably still operating, Yamamoto realized that if he persisted in pushing forces eastward in search of a night battle, he was likely to get a dawn air attack instead. Everyone on his staff felt the same, and finally at 2:55 June 5th, Yamamoto bowed to the logic of events and ordered a general retirement. He was destined never to have the big fleet engagement which he so ardently desired. Some 80 American aviators had seen to that. He had lost all his fast carriers together with their entire complement of planes, about 250 in number. Never was there a sharper turn in the fortunes of war than on that June day when McCluskey's and Leslie's dive bombers snatched the palm from Nagumo's masthead, where he had nailed it on the 7th of December. Deep gloom settled over the entire combined fleet. "I wonder what are the feelings of the ones who planned this," confided an officer of the landing force to his diary. "We are retreating. It is utterly discouraging. The Marines, who were showing off, have not even courage to drink beer." Could one say more? The 4th of June, day that should live forever glorious in our history, decided the Battle of Midway. By destroying the 4 Japanese carriers and their air groups, the American aviators had extracted the sting from the combined fleet. Everything that followed now appears as anticlimax, but the situation during the night of 4, the 5th of June, was far from clear to the people at Midway, to Fletcher and Spruance, or, for that matter, to Nimitz and Yamamoto. Spruance, whose freedom of movement was confirmed by Fletcher after the abandonment of Yorktown, could not be certain that the 4 enemy carriers attacked by his force and Yorktown were out for keeps. A disturbing bit of news came in from Major Blakey's B-17S. When attacking the burning Hiryu late in the afternoon, they had encountered a number of Zeeks. These must have flown off Hiryu before she was abandoned, and were simply doing what they could before ditching. But for aught he knew, they might have come from a 5th carrier. Spruance knew that the Japanese supporting naval forces, which nobody had yet found, included carriers. With Yorktown disabled, the air groups of his own carriers decimated, and no support in sight, he had to calculate the possible damage he could inflict against the risks involved. As he explained in his report, "I did not feel justified in risking a night encounter with possibly superior enemy forces, but on the other hand, I did not want to be too far away from Midway the next morning. I wished to have a position from which either to follow up retreating enemy forces or to break up a landing attack on Midway." Consequently, he withdrew Enterprise and Hornet to the eastward and did not reverse course until midnight. Spruance was subjected to much criticism after the action for not having given chase immediately after 1907 June 4th, when he had recovered planes from his strike on Hiryu. By steaming eastward for 5 hours, it was claimed, he had given the enemy time to escape. This criticism was based on ignorance of what Yamamoto was doing. Now that we have ample data of Japanese ship movements, it is clear that Spruance's judgment was sound and his decision correct. A glance at our chart for the 5th of June will show why. Vice Admiral Kondo, when he received news of the first serious attack on the striking force, around noon the 4th of June, decided on his own responsibility to come to Nagumo's assistance. Leaving the transports almost unprotected, Commander-in-Chief 2nd Fleet, in heavy cruiser Atago with 3 other heavies, 2 Congo-class battleships, light carrier Zuibo, and a destroyer squadron, commenced at the 14th of June for a high-speed run to the northeastward. By midnight, most of Kondo's force was about 125 miles from the battleships and cruisers formerly under Nagumo's command, and Rear Admiral Tanaka in Jintsu with 10 destroyers was not far behind. If Enterprise and Hornet had steamed westward instead of eastward after 19, they would have run smack into this heavy concentration shortly after midnight, which was exactly what the Japanese wanted. Their ships were better trained for night action than ours. There was a last quarter moon which to some extent would have neutralized the advantage of radar, and carriers without night-flying, radar-equipped planes are exceedingly vulnerable after dark. Furthermore, even if Kondo could do no more than hold Spruance, the Japanese main body was fast approaching from the northwest. Yamamoto would have been handed the fleet action he so ardently desired on a silver platter. At Pearl Harbor and in Washington too, the situation was far from clear. Nimitz and King were very cautious in their releases. On the 5th of June, Commander-in-Chief Pacific announced, "It is too early to claim a major Japanese disaster. The enemy appear to be withdrawing, but we are continuing the battle." On the 6th, he went so far as to say, "A momentous victory is in the making, but the battle is not over. The following enemy losses are claimed: 2 or 3 carriers and all their aircraft destroyed, in addition to 1 or 2 carriers badly damaged." Next day, the 7th, Admiral King held his first press conference since he had become Chief of Naval Operations. "Although the enemy's forces have taken some hard knocks," he said, "I would not say they have been defeated yet. They have withdrawn." And, in answer to a journalist who expressed the hope that the Pacific Fleet would chase the Japanese all the way to Japan, he remarked that such action might not be well advised. Certainly, if we had been in Yamamoto's place, we would have tried another throw of the dice before going home, and Yamamoto almost did so. Exactly when did the Japanese commander-in-chief realize he was not going to take Midway? Our guess is shortly after midnight between 4 and the 5th of June. At 20:30 June 4th, he had ordered submarine Y-768 to close Midway and shell the air base until the 2nd of June 5, when Admiral Kurita's close support group would take over and complete destruction of the installations, preparatory to landing. Kurita's 4 cruisers, Kumano, Suzuya, Mikuma, and Mogami, equal in size and strength to our later Baltimore class and about 3 knots faster, were the most powerful then afloat. They had fought all through the Southwest Pacific Campaign and were victors of several engagements. There is no doubt that the combined firepower of their 48-inch 50-caliber guns would have inflicted great damage on Midway, but at 0:20 June 5th, Yamamoto cancelled the scheduled bombardment and ordered Kurita to join the main body. Then, as we have already seen, at 2:55 he ordered a general retirement. The fueling rendezvous that he then set for the 7th of June was so far to the northwestward as to prove that he had definitely abandoned the landing on Midway. The 5th of June was a glum day on board Yamato, as the Admiral's yeoman recalled the scene. The Admiral's air officer, with sunken eyes and 2 days' growth of beard, seemed in a daze. Yamamoto sat sipping rice gruel helplessly on the forward bridge. His face was ashen, his eyes glittered. He was furiously thinking. Perhaps there was still a chance to bait Spruance into a surface engagement. Fortunately, 3 United States submarines of the Midway Patrol Group had been left at their stations west of the atoll when the rest went north to chase Japanese carriers. At about 2:15 June 5th, Admiral Kurita's column of 4 Japanese cruisers and 2 destroyers was sighted in the moonlight by submarine Tambor at a position 90 miles due west of Midway. The boat observed this force commence its retirement, Kurita having received Yamamoto's 0:20 order, and at 3:42 was herself sighted. Kurita ordered an emergency turn. Cruiser Mogami, last in the column, failed to get the word promptly and rammed the port quarter of Mikuma, next ahead. Both were damaged, Mogami catching fire and smashing so much of her bow that she was unable to make more than 12 knots, and Mikuma trailing oil. The Admiral continued full-speed retirement with his 2 untouched cruisers, leaving both destroyers to screen the damaged ones. Tambor's skipper, Lieutenant Commander Murphy, was unable to get in position to shoot, but he tracked the enemy ships and identified them at break of day, around 4:12. In the meantime, all hands at Midway passed a sleepless night hard at work, repairing damage and fueling planes by hand pumps from 55-gallon drums. Japanese submarine Y-168, after prowling about the atoll for over 3 hours, began its scheduled bombardment at 1:30, but the shells dropped in the lagoon and the boat was soon driven off by return fire from the Marines' coast defence batteries. Shortly before dawn, the 5th of June, all available PBYs were sent out to search the sector 250 degrees to 20 degrees for 250 miles out, and 12 B-17 SA followed them at 4:30. A Catalina sighted Mogami and Mikuma, which it took to be battleships, and on receipt of this report, Captain Simard ordered the forts to attack. At 6:15 they reported inability to find the targets. Simard then sent out his marine bombing squadron, which had lost 2 commanding officers the day before. Only 6 SBDs and 6 Vindicators were fit for the mission. They took off promptly in clear weather, picked up an oil slick at 7:45, followed it to the westward, found the 2 cruisers, and attacked at 8:05, the SBDs dive bombing and the Vindicators glide bombing. Mogami and Mikuma threw up such heavy and accurate anti-aircraft fire that the planes were badly bounced about and their aim spoiled. The final score was 6 near misses and 1 plane crash on an after-turret of Mikuma, a brave sacrifice hit by Captain Richard E. Fleming, USMC of the SB-2U formation. Tambor's original contact report of Kurita's group as many unidentified ships at 2:15 June 5th was relayed to Admiral Spruance. It looked to him as if an enemy landing at Midway were still on the cards, so at 4:20 he altered course from west to southwest, 230 degrees, in order to close the atoll and render air support. At 6, when he had reached a position about 130 miles northeasterly of Midway, he began to receive search plane reports, first of the 2 cruisers that had collided, and then of a large enemy disposition about 200 miles to the northwestward. Delayed and confusing reports from scouting PBYs of the burning Hiryu created the impression that 2 enemy carriers were afloat though damaged. Here was a situation that required clear thinking. At about 9:30, Spruance altered course to due west and passed about 50 miles north of Midway. After considering which group of targets to choose for his next plane attack, he selected the one to the northwestward for its promise of 1 or more carriers still afloat, changed course to NW by W, 300 degrees, at 11:25 and began a stern chase. At 15 he turned into the gentle east wind to launch a search and attack group. Launching of 32 SBDs from Enterprise and 26 from Hornet was completed at 15:43 June 5th. There was a heavy overcast and poor visibility. The 2 groups searched respectively 315 and 265 miles out on a 30-mile front to the northwestward, but found no target of any importance. On the return flight, they encountered destroyer Tanikaze, detached by Nagumo to ascertain whether Hiryu was still afloat. The Japanese destroyer skipper, who had already dodged bombs dropped in 2 separate attacks by Midway-based B-17S that afternoon, was equally successful in evading the 50-odd SBDs that made dive-bombing attacks and shot down one of them. The others returned safely after nightfall and made one of the first successful night landings in our carrier combat history. Thus, the 5th of June passed without any further damage being inflicted on the retiring enemy, except the crash on Mikuma, which cost Captain Fleming his life. Admiral Spruance had once more proved the truth of the old naval maxim, "A stern chase is a long chase." Deciding it was no use trying to catch Kondo, he changed course to the westward at 20:40 in search of the 2 damaged cruisers. As may be seen by our chart, Yamamoto had collected 4 of his scattered group: Konsto's Second Fleet, Tanaka's destroyer squadron, Takasu's Aleutian screening force, and the battleship and cruiser components of Nagumo's striking force, and had retired well beyond the range of Spruance's planes, though not of those based on Midway. 11 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, several destroyer divisions, and 2 light carriers were under his immediate command, and, except for those under Nagumo and Kurita, no ship of this great fleet had yet fired a shot or sighted an enemy plane. Mogami and Mikuma saw plenty. Before the sun rose on the 6th of June to a clear, hot day, Enterprise launched a reconnaissance flight which picked up the 2 crippled cruisers making best speed to the westward. By 8, the first attack group of 26 SBDs and 8 F-4Fs took off from Hornet, the second of 31 SBDs, 3 TBDs and 12 F-4Fs from Enterprise followed at 10:45, and a third of 24 SBDs and 8 F-4Fs was launched at 13:30 from Hornet. The wind was light from the southwest, blowing straight from the enemy, so that the carriers closed distance rapidly between strikes. By the time of the third strike, they were within 90 miles of him, and pilots flying high could see both forces at the same time in the clear air. The two damaged cruisers, with no air defense, even their float planes had been jettisoned, were neat targets. Mogami in the first attack received 2 bomb hits, one of which penetrated Numtar 5 turret and terminated everyone within. 2 more hits in the second attack started fires, and a third sealed up 1 burning engine room and eliminated over 90 men. Mogami apparently had a charmed life. She managed to make truck for temporary repairs. But it was over a year before she was able to rejoin the fleet. Mikuma was less fortunate. After the second attack, the captain ordered her abandoned. Destroyer Arashio, after an attempt to close which was ineffectual owing to the fires, recovered hundreds of men from the water. When Hornet's final dive bomber attack came in about 1445, most of the survivors on the deck of this destroyer lost their lives by a bomb. Another bomb hit on Mikuma detonated the cruiser's torpedoes. Both screening destroyers left the cruiser to her fate, and she went down that night. At 1553, Enterprise launched 2 camera-equipped SBDs to photograph the damaged ships. They failed to locate Mogami, but took the photographs of Mikuma in her death agonies that are among the most remarkable of the Pacific War. Promptly released, these photographs told the public better than any words that the air age had arrived in naval warfare. If they could have known what we now know, that Mogami and Mikuma were the cruisers that had sunk Houston and Perth, they would have enjoyed the photographs even more. 2 incidents, one comic and one tragic, concluded this busy day. Midway Island had been reinforced by so many flying fortresses from Oahu since the 4th that 26 of the big 4-engine bombers were now available. 1 hour after he had received Spruance's reports of contacts on the cruisers, Captain Simard dispatched these B-17s to help put Mogami and Mikuma under. Owing to lack of training in navigation, their pilots were unable to locate the enemy, but during the afternoon, one group of 6 sighted a vessel, identified it as a Japanese cruiser, and dropped a pattern of 21,000-pound explosives from an altitude of over 10,000 feet. On their return to Midway, these B-17 pilots declared they had sunk this vessel in the unprecedented time of 15 seconds. A few days later, United States submarine Grayling came into port, her crew inquiring angrily why they had been bombed by B-17s and forced to crash dive at the exact position where the Japanese cruiser had been sunk. The tragic incident was a gallant attempt by Major General Clarence L. Tinker, United States of America, to knock out the Japanese bomber base at Wake. In command of 4 new Army Liberators that reached Midway from the west coast on the 6th of June, General Tinker took off that very night. Each plane carried extra gas tanks and 4 500-pound bombs. Overcast prevented the navigators from checking their long course by star sights. They were unable to find the little atoll by the time there was just enough gas left to get back. General Tinker's plane disappeared early in the flight. No trace of it or of him was ever found. Admiral Spruance, after recovering the 2 photographic planes around sundown the 6th of June, re-estimated the situation with his usual clarity. His pilots were exhausted after 3 days flying and fighting. He had only 4 destroyers to screen his 2 carriers and 6 cruisers, and they had not been fueled from a tanker since the 31st of May. His task force had now reached longitude 174°30'E, over 400 miles west of Midway. There was little prospect of gain in continuing the stern chase, and much risk of trouble through running into a concentration of enemy submarines or within the range of Wake-based bombers. Spruance, feeling that he had pushed his luck far enough, turned the prows of his ships eastward to where Cimarron and Guadalupe were waiting to give them a big drink of oil. The Battle of Midway was over. Yamamoto did not yet know it. When he received word by radio of the first attack on Mogami and Mikuma on the 6th of June, together with a poor search plane contact report to the effect that Enterprise and Hornet were operating due east of the 2 cruisers, he thought he saw a chance to reverse the verdict of battle. Forming a new task force out of 6 heavy cruisers and the Jintsu destroyer squadron, he ordered them at noon to make best speed south, rendezvous with Mogami and Mikuma, and attack Spruance. More than that, Hoping that Task Force 16 in its pursuit of the cruisers would work south to within bomber distance, 600 miles of Wake Atoll, Yamamoto called up air reinforcements from the Marshals, and at 15:50 June 6th, he ordered his main body and Second Fleet to steam south and engage when and if Spruance took the bait. Yamamoto actually commenced this southward movement in search of a fight, and so continued until the 7th of June 7, when he turned west to a fueling rendezvous. His cruiser-destroyer force, however, found crippled Mogami and gave her escort to Truk. By the afternoon of the 7th, Yamamoto had dropped his last plan for an offensive. After spending most of the 8th fueling, he started for home, this time for keeps. Yet even then he sent 2 heavy cruisers and a destroyer division to cruise in the vicinity of Wake and send out heavy radio traffic designed to bait Spruance within air-bombing radius of the atoll. The abandonment and subsequent loss of the carrier Yorktown, so quickly repaired and so gallantly fought, is the one blot on an otherwise golden scroll of victory. That she should not have been abandoned after the torpedo plane attack on the 4th of June is proved by the fact that she reached equilibrium when she had listed 25 degrees and floated for 24 hours without any human hand to help. To aviators who flew over her on the 5th of June, she appeared to be intact, not burning, and not healing too badly. The abandonment was orderly if incomplete. Within a couple of hours, 2,270 survivors, almost her entire crew, were on board the 7 destroyers of the screen. Shortly after the abandonment, Admiral Fletcher in Astoria, with Portland and all destroyers of his task force, started eastward, intending to transfer survivors to the cruisers. At 18, he detached Hughes to stand by the empty carrier with orders to sink her if there were danger of capture by the enemy. Hughes located Yorktown shortly after dark on the 4th of June and stood by all night. At dawn, the destroyer's commanding officer notified Commander-in-Chief Pacific that, in his opinion, Yorktown could be saved. Just before the end of the morning watch, his lookouts observed the splash of machine gun bullets in the water on the port side of the derelict carrier and saw a man on deck waving. A boarding party from Hughes returned with 2 seamen, one with a serious abdominal wound and the other suffering from a fractured skull and other injuries. Both had been left for dead in the sick bay. The former, who died shortly after his rescue, had managed to crawl topside and fire machine guns to attract attention. A thorough inspection found no more men alive, but 3 coding machines intact and numerous secret publications lying about. Lieutenant Commander Ramsey also sent a small salvage party, all he could spare, on board the carrier. If only there had been a fleet tug with the task force, Yorktown might have been towed to safety. Or, lacking a tug, she might have been taken in tow by a cruiser as Admiral Fletcher originally intended, and as was done with other damaged carriers later in the war. Admiral Nimitz ordered to Yorktown's assistance fleet tug Navajo, then patrolling south of French frigate Shoals, minesweeper Vireo, then patrolling off Pearl and Hermes Reef, and destroyer Gwyn, which was hurrying out to join Spruance. Vireo, the nearest, arrived first, found Yorktown with Hughes standing by shortly before noon, the 5th of June, and by 14:26 had passed her a tow line, but she was barely able to make headway with the heavy carrier against the trade wind. A little over an hour later, destroyer Gwyn arrived and found Yorktown listing to port about 25 degrees and slightly down by the head. Commander Holcomb sent on board a small salvage party which, in cooperation with the one from Hughes, had time before nightfall to jettison anchors and various loose gear. But nothing could be accomplished after dark when the men returned to Gwyn. During most of the 5th, while Vireo struggled with the carrier against a rising sea, Astoria and Portland were about 150 miles to the eastward fueling destroyers and taking over survivors. At about noon, Admiral Fletcher and Captain Buckmaster decided to do what they should have done the previous evening, to send a proper salvage party on board the carrier and attempt to bring her into port. The captain, 29 selected officers and 141 men who volunteered for the job were transferred to destroyer Hammond, which, escorted by destroyers Balch and Benham, set a course for Yorktown, over 24 hours after she had been abandoned. They sighted her, still being towed at snail's pace by Little Vireo and guarded by destroyers Hughes, Gwyn and Monaghan, at 2 June 6th. Before daybreak, Hammond secured to Yorktown's starboard side, transferred the salvage party and provided power, pumps and water for their work. A careful plan of action had been laid out beforehand, and Captain Buckmaster and his men worked like beavers. They quenched the one remaining fire, corrected the list by counter-flooding with the aid of Hammond's power pumps, jettisoned planes and removable weights from the port side, and had made considerable progress by mid-afternoon. 4 or 5 destroyers circled the carrier unit 2,000 yards out, operating their echo-ranging sound gear, sufficient anti-submarine screen by any standard, and these destroyers were veterans of anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic. But sound conditions were poor, owing to oil and flotsam from the carrier, and visibility was perfect. Yorktown might still have been saved, but for smart work by the enemy. At dawn, the 5th of June, Admiral Nagumo had sent 2 cruiser float planes to search eastward. One of them, about 7, reported Yorktown abandoned and drifting. Shortly after receiving this word, Yamamoto ordered submarine I-168, which had shelled Midway early that morning, to go get the carrier. As the plane had given the position wrong, I-168 spent over 24 hours searching, but in the early afternoon of June 6th, pertinacity was rewarded by sight of the Yorktown group. The submarine skillfully penetrated the screen undetected, reached a perfect position for a 1-2 shot, and at about 13:30 fired 4 torpedoes. One missed, 2 went under Hammond's keel and exploded on Yorktown, and 1 hit the destroyer amidships, breaking her in 2 so that she sank within 4 minutes with great loss of life. While 3 destroyers hunted the submarine in vain until almost midnight, and 2 picked up survivors, Hiryu cut the towline and transferred the salvage party to destroyer Benham. Captain Buckmaster intended to resume salvage operations at first light, the 7th of June. During the night, the carrier's list suddenly increased, and at dawn it was evident she was doomed. The escorting destroyers half-masted their colours, all hands came to attention, uncovered, and at 6, with her loose gear making a horrible death rattle, Yorktown rolled over and sank in a 2,000-fathom deep. The best comment on this unfortunate loss, which the Navy could ill afford at that juncture, is an order issued by Admiral Nimitz before the end of the month. In the event a ship receives such severe battle damage that abandonment may be a possibility, a skeletonized crew to effect rescue of the ship shall be ready either to remain on board or to be placed in an attendant vessel. At this time, the Aleutian situation was still obscure, and Admiral Nimitz believed that there was more work for his carriers up north. Saratoga, flying the flag of Rear Admiral Aubrey W. Fitch, escorted by light cruiser San Diego and 4 destroyers, had been making best speed from the west coast while the Battle of Midway was going on, and arrived at Pearl Harbor on the morning of the 6th of June. Within 24 hours she had fueled, collected another destroyer and oiler Kaskaskia, and departed. Fitch's orders were to rendezvous with Spruance at a point about 200 miles north of Niueihau, turn over as many replacement planes to Enterprise and Hornet as they required, and return to Pearl. Spruance was then to take his carriers up north to engage enemy forces in the Aleutians. The rendezvous was made as planned, and the 2 carriers took on 34 replacement planes from Saratoga. But all hands were relieved when, early on the 11th of June, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific suspected that Yamamoto was setting up a trap for our carriers south of Kiska and ordered the victorious Task Force 16 back to Pearl Harbor. On Midway Atoll, the principal business on the days following the battle was repair and air-sea rescue. Commander Massey Hughes sent his Catalinas out on daily rescue missions, flying as low as 100 feet above the water in the cold front to the northwestward. In 10 days, they rescued 27 aviators who were floating on life rafts, including Lieutenant J.G. Gaylord Probst, who had made the initial hit of the battle. Midway was the second of 5 great battles in the Pacific in which aircraft did all the hitting, with some assistance from submarines, but none from ships' gunfire, except, of course, the anti-aircraft batteries. Even more than Coral Sea, it emphasized the vital role of carrier-borne air power in modern naval warfare. Yamamoto had to abandon his mission despite the possession of vastly superior gun power, and without firing a shot, because Fletcher and Spruance, with one well-directed carrier thrust, had destroyed the Japanese air component while preserving most of their own. The tactical performance of the three American carrier air groups would have been considered ragged later in the war. Yet they had won through courage, determination, and the quick seizure of opportunities. The performance of land-based air, on the contrary, had been most disappointing, both in bombing and in searching. Two squadrons of well-trained scout planes based on Midway, engaged only in finding and tracking enemy ships, might have accomplished more for the cause than all the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps bombers together. Midway was a victory of intelligence, bravely and wisely applied. Had we lacked early information of the Japanese movements, and had we been caught with carrier forces dispersed, the Battle of Midway would have ended differently, commented Admiral Nimitz. So, too, it might have ended differently, but for the chance which gave Spruance command over two of the three flat tops. Fletcher did well, but Spruance's performance was superb. Lord of himself, yet receptive to advice, keeping in his mind the picture of widely disparate forces yet boldly seizing every opening, Raymond A. Spruance emerged from this battle one of the greatest fighting and thinking admirals in American naval history. The Japanese knew very well that they were beaten. "I felt bitter," remembered Nagumo's chief of staff. "I felt like swearing." Before the ships reached home, Tokyo Rose and other official broadcasters began making the usual claims that an incredible number of United States planes and ships had been shot down, sunk, or damaged, but these loudspeakers were soon muzzled, and word went out from Imperial headquarters that Midway was taboo. It thrust the Japanese warlords back on their heels, caused their ambitious plans for the conquest of Fiji, New Caledonia, and New Zealand to be cancelled, and forced on them the unexpected and unwelcome role of the defensive. Midway was the first really smashing defeat inflicted on the Japanese Navy in modern times. Yet there were two consolations for Yamamoto. The Japanese fleet was intact, except for the carriers, and the Northern Area Force had occupied Kiska and Attu. On a globe, the Aleutian chain resembles the Malay barrier that the Japanese made such efforts to secure, but there the likeness stops. The Aleutians are one of the Earth's poorest regions in natural resources. A Nisei translation of a Japanese army report puts it neatly. As for useful resources available such as food, there are only 2 or 3 types of birds, fox, marine animals, and few seaweeds, besides the comparatively plentiful fishes. That is what the Aleuts live on, but few others can. All the islands are very mountainous, with no trees, few places level enough for an airfield, and few harbours affording shelter to large ships. They are covered by tundra, a spongy mat of dead grass from 1 to 4 feet thick, difficult to walk on and impossible to drive over. And under the tundra is a black volcanic ash that turns to mud when it rains, as it generally does. In 1941, the islands were uninhabited except for the army and navy establishments at Dutch Harbour and small Aleut settlements in that vicinity and on Atka and Attu. Although operations in the Aleutians were something more than a sideshow to the Midway affair, they might be called the 5th and least important ring in Yamamoto's greatest show on Earth, the one where the less graceful acrobats, the not quite trained animals, and the second-string clowns catered to the 50-cent seats. Kiska, to be sure, was cast for a role in the new defensive perimeter against which the United States Navy was expected to beat out its brains, but Yamamoto would doubtless have traded the whole Aleutian chain, if he had it, for one little 1,000-acre lot called Midway. Naturally, the President of the United States, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Commander-in-Chief, and Commander-in-Chief Pacific could take no such frivolous view of the Aleutians. These islands belonged to Alaska territory, and there is always a strong public sentiment against relinquishing a portion of one's sacred soil, no matter how worthless to the enemy. And on the globe, the Aleutians looked like a natural Japanese invasion route to the United States, by the island-hopping technique so successful in the East Indies. The Great Circle course from Tokyo to Seattle and San Francisco skirts their southern shores. Attu, westernmost of the chain, is only 650 miles from Paramushiro in the Kuriles, where the enemy had a naval and air base. From Attu it is only 725 miles by air to Dutch Harbour, Unalaska, the westernmost United States base there before the war, and from Dutch Harbour to Juneau, the capital of Alaska, is but another 1158 miles by airline along the coast. Major prophets like Homer Lear and Billy Mitchell had long ago predicted that the Japanese would invade the United States that way, and the possibility could not be overlooked. The Japanese did many foolish things during the war, but never, so far as we know, did they seriously contemplate anything so idiotic as invading the United States via the Aleutians. Yet they thought we were foolish enough to try the reverse. The short distances that we have cited are less significant than the air distance from Attu to Japanese industrial centers, roughly 2,000 miles, or from Paramushiro to the nearest American industrial center, Seattle, 3,150 miles. Any invading force would have to be transported by air or sea. The Alaskan terrain precludes all possibility of motorized ground invasion. Ships and planes would have to cope with Aleutian weather, chronically unsettled and often bursting out in violent and unpredictable tempests, the famous Willy Wars, a major menace to navigation owing to a continual conflict between the warm Japanese current and the bitterly cold air masses flowing down over the Bering Sea. Rain, snow, mist, or a low, thick overcast may be expected 365 days a year in the Aleutians. Flying weather is the exception rather than the rule. And about the 1st of June begins the foggy season when activity of planes and warships are restrained considerably. But, he adds cheerfully, there is no fear of icebergs. The same weather and terrain conditions made this invasion route equally unattractive to American strategists, although in the speculation of sundry amateurs it appeared to be the natural route for attacking Japan. Build a few bomber strips in the islands, send hundreds of superfortresses every day to bomb Japanese industrial centers, and the war would be won. Eventually, when we developed an airfield at Attu, it became a useful base for attacking Paramushiro, pinning down Japanese forces in the Kuriles and keeping their high command guessing. But any large-scale bombing offensive along that line would have expended B-29s faster than they could be built. General Buckner made a witty and true estimate of the possibility of a Japanese invasion of the United States by the Aleutians Alaska route. They might make it, but it would be their grandchildren who finally got there, and by then they would all be American citizens anyway. Yet, impracticable as this invasion route was, the United States Army and Navy could not afford to assume that the enemy was too intelligent to attempt it. Nor could the Japanese warlords risk the chance that American air fanatics might prevail over sound strategic sense. 5 years before the war, Alaska was virtually undefended. In 1937, Rear Admiral Ernest J. King, then Commander Fleet Aircraft, obtained a few $1,000s for the development of a seaplane base at Sitka. The Hepburn Board recommended an expenditure of $19 million to improve the Sitka base, and to develop others for seaplanes and submarines on Kodiak, and at Dutch Harbour at the eastern extremity of the Aleutians. Congress made the appropriation, the work began under civilian contractors, Seabees and Army engineers continued it throughout the war. By September 1941, Sitka, Kodiak and Dutch Harbour had been commissioned as naval air stations, and the last two were ready to service submarines. In the light of later events, it would have been better to have started with Dutch Harbour and placed the other two bases well out on the Aleutians chain. But the Hepburn Board rejected this suggestion for the good reason that weather conditions would have made the building and maintenance of such far-flung bases unduly hazardous and expensive, and the unspoken but no less real reason that any such action would probably have been viewed by Japan as an invasion threat and touched off the war. Naval efforts were supplemented by those of the Civil Aeronautics Authority and Army engineers who, in the face of many obstacles, built a series of staging fields north from Puget Sound inland and out to Cold Bay on the Alaskan Peninsula. Finally, in the early months of 1942, Army engineers commanded by Colonel Benjamin B. Talley, overcoming unheard-of conditions with notable enterprise and energy, built a 5,000-foot runway on Otter Point, the northern end of the island of Umnak, within supporting distance of Dutch Harbour. This airstrip was so unstable that fighter planes bounced 30 feet into the air on impact. Aviators said it was like landing on an inner spring mattress, and every bomber that landed gave the field a sort of permanent wave. The 11th Army Air Force, commanded by Brigadier General William O. Butler, garrisoned these airfields, but only 2 Army aircraft warning radar sets were in operation in the whole of Alaska. In mid-1940, the Army had established the Alaskan Defense Command under Brigadier General Simon Bolivar Buckner. The Navy followed suit by creating an Alaskan sector under the 13th Naval District, whose headquarters were at Seattle, and appointing Captain Ralph C. Parker to the command. Gunboat Charleston was assigned to him as a headquarters flagship. 3 small fishing vessels were purchased, converted to patrol craft, as the nucleus of the Alaskan Navy. These were controlled by a local character of infinite resource, energy, and cunning, Commander Charles E. Anderson, USNR. By May 1942, Captain Parker had under his command, in order to defend Alaska and its coastwise commerce from enemy submarines or whatever else they might send thither, 2 old destroyers, 1 240-foot and 2 165-foot Coast Guard cutters, a few more converted fishing vessels and 10 Catalinas, 1 each at Dutch Harbor and Kodiak, the others farther south. Flagship Charleston was the only one of these vessels equipped with sonar or with guns larger than 3-inch. Both she and the cutters and destroyers were in constant use escorting freighters bringing construction workers and material to the new bases and airfields, none of which were complete. The setup offered unusual opportunities for enemy submarines. But, as if in answer to prayer, the big Japanese I-boats confined themselves to reconnaissance. Such was the situation. Air-base developments underway, and the most meagre of ground force, air or naval protection to Alaska, when word reached Commander-in-Chief Pacific in early May that a thrust by the Japanese into Alaskan waters would form part of their Midway operation in early June. Admiral Nimitz reacted, as we have seen, by allocating 5 cruisers, 14 destroyers, 6 submarines and suitable auxiliaries to deal with this northern menace, and by placing them, as well as Captain Parker's Alaskan Navy, under the command of Rear Admiral Robert A. Theobald, one of the most able and energetic flag officers in the Navy. Task Force 8 was activated the 21st of May 1942, but its components had to be collected from various parts of the Pacific and the main body. 5 cruisers and 4 destroyers did not get together until a few hours after the Japanese first struck Dutch Harbor. This is not to say that the Alaskan sector was unprepared. Admiral Theobald was unable to reach Kodiak until the 27th of May, but Captain Parker and General Buckner had been alerted almost 2 weeks earlier and had done everything possible to send civilians and merchant shipping out and bring ships, planes, and fighting men in. As Commander-in-Chief, Pacific, on orders of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had declared a state of fleet-opposed invasion in the Alaskan sector, Admiral Theobald commanded all defense forces, including the Army Air Force. But as a newcomer in Alaska, he chose to assert his prerogative discreetly and to obtain Army cooperation by persuasion rather than command. In a 4-day conference with General Butler, Captain Parker, Captain Gehres, and other key officers, he worked out a task organization and an operation plan for his surface, submarine, tender-based naval air and Army air components. The details of the task organization will be found in the next section. Suffice it here to mention the 6 principal groups with what they were called upon to accomplish. 1. Main body, 5 cruisers and 4 destroyers under Admiral Theobald's personal command. To patrol south of Kodiak and exploit opportunities, that is, look for a chance to fight. 2. Surface search group, the old Alaskan Navy, largely composed of patrol craft, to act as pickets to signal the enemy's approach. 3. Air search group, 20 Catalinas and 1 B-17 based on tenders at Cold Bay, Sandpoint and Dutch Harbor, to fly daily searches, locate and track Japanese forces. 4. Air striking group, about 65 Army pursuit planes and 20 medium and heavy bombers, at Kodiak, Cold Bay and Umnak, together with reinforcements at Anchorage, to attack enemy ships when located. 5. Destroyer striking group, 9 destroyers stationed at Makushin Bay, Unalaska, to strike enemy forces approaching Dutch Harbor or Cold Bay. 6. Submarine group, 6 boats, disposed in the hope of intercepting the enemy. This North Pacific Force, as Task Force 8 was subsequently designated, had much less information of enemy movements or intentions than had Fletcher and Spruance of what the Japanese were after farther south. Admiral Nimitz knew fairly accurately, and let Admiral Theobald know, the composition of the second mobile force, whose first mission was to strike Dutch Harbor, and he suspected that 1 or more amphibious groups were moving up behind it. But he had no intelligence of where the carrier planes intended to strike, nor until the 28th of May, of where the amphibious groups proposed to land. The general expectation was that the second mobile force would beat up the 3 American bases at Umnak, Dutch Harbour and Cold Bay, after which ground forces would attempt to seize these bases or positions near them. What the ultimate intentions of the enemy were in this quarter nobody knew, possibly only to establish a sort of roadblock against the United States using this northern route to attack Japan, but not improbably to seize vantage points for an invasion of the Canadian and American Northwest. Washington had not yet recovered from the anything can happen now feeling that followed Pearl Harbor. Many important people believed that there would be an invasion of or strike on the West Coast, rather than on Midway or the Aleutians. Consequently, hundreds of Army planes which might have been useful in the Aleutians were retained on West Coast fields. Now that Japanese sources are available, it becomes humorously evident that their globe gazers too had been impressed with these deceptively short distances, and that the Halsey Doolittle raid on Tokyo had given Imperial headquarters a bad case of the jitters. Yet, despite all the Japanese fishermen and sealers who infested Aleutian waters before the war, the enemy knew very little about Aleutian topography and still less of American activities there since the war's beginning. The Japanese planners thought that Dutch Harbour was garrisoned by a whole army division instead of, as was the case, by 4,748 troops and 639 bluejackets and Marines, including the aviation ground crews, that Kiska, where we had a total of 10 unarmed men in a weather reporting station, was defended by 200 or 300 Marines, and that Attu, where Mr. and Mrs. Charles Jones ministered to the needs of a small Aleut village, supported a wireless station, observatory and garrison unit of unknown strength. Enemy plane reconnaissance of these western islands was thwarted by weather. Submarine reconnaissance of them and of Dutch Harbour was more successful, but came too late to change the operation plan. Imperial headquarters had toyed with the idea of capturing Dutch Harbour, which was what many high-ranking Americans expected them to do, but decided against it because insufficient shipping was available. The main show of Midway and the multitude of other commitments in the south and southwest took almost everything afloat that flew the rising sun. However, Vice Admiral Hosogaya, who was given the command and the responsibility, could deploy in the Aleutians fairly strong forces. 1. Second mobile force, built around 2 light carriers, whose objective was to strike Dutch Harbour the 3rd of June in order a. to deceive Nimitz into the belief that the main Japanese attack was coming there, and so deflect his forces from Midway. b. Destroy installations that might be intended for mounting an air invasion of Japan. c. Cover and support the 2 following. 2. Kiska Occupation Force, 500 special naval landing troops, and 700 or more construction men to capture that island and make it the northern anchor of the new ribbon defence. 3. Adak Attu Occupation Force, 1,200 army troops in 2 transports, the first to take Adak and the second Attu, mainly in order to deny them to United States forces. That was all. The Japanese had no intention of capturing anything east of Adak. They had no plan for invading the Alaskan mainland, Canada, or the United States. The Aleutian section of the Midway operation, apart from its diversionary aspect, was essentially defensive. Its object was to prevent the United States invading Japan. The High Command even suspected that American invasion forces were already concentrating along the Seattle, Dutch Harbour axis. Accordingly, in May, there was a careful reconnaissance of these possible invasion ports by submarines. I-26, a plane-carrying submarine, even steamed to the outer coast of the state of Washington, where it launched a plane to reconnoitre Seattle. The plane reported, much to the relief of the High Command, that no heavy ships were there. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Staff finally smelt out these modest designs of the enemy on the Aleutians, and Nimitz so informed Theobald on the 28th of May, in a dispatch which said that his intelligence believed that the Japanese Aleutian forces included one task group destined for Kiska and another which might well be for Attu. Theobald, however, feared that the information upon which this was based might be a ruse to draw him westward and get behind him. He still believed that the enemy would try to land somewhere between Umnak and Cold Bay in order to seize Dutch Harbour. The danger to us, if he did, was so much greater than any possible damage he could do in the western Aleutians that the Admiral decided to deploy his main body in waters about 400 miles due south of Kodiak, whence he could defend the eastern Aleutians and Alaska. After all, if a small and inadequate police force is warned of an impending bank robbery, but receives an 11th-hour tip-off that the gang is only going to rifle a rural mailbox, it would be unwise to relax vigilance at the bank. Admiral Theobald's situation was very difficult. He felt that he had not the force to cope with Admiral Kakuta's 2 carriers. Army planes could not follow him out to sea and provide air cover. The fat Navy Catalinas were suitable only for patrol and search. If Theobald should lead his main body boldly westward, seeking a gunfire engagement, he might wake up to find Kakuta between him and his base. Or, if Kakuta decided to gratify him, it would only be after inflicting serious attrition by carrier plane strikes. A night destroyer attack on Kakuta would be a farce because there is no night in 55 degrees north latitude in June, but the 9 destroyers based near Dutch Harbour should manage to break up an enemy landing. It all came down to this. Initial reliance had to be placed on the 2 air forces to perform the functions for which they were designed Navy Catalinas and Army pursuit planes to locate and track the enemy ships, and Army bombers to hit them. After that, Theobald might find an opportunity to use his guns. The PBYs were well deployed when Theobald arrived at Kodiak 12 of the 20 at Dutch Harbour, but the Army planes were not. General Butler, to the Admiral's consternation, proposed to base the bulk of them at Kodiak and Anchorage, and to leave unoccupied the 2 westernmost Army airfields because of their unfinished condition. Admiral Theobald, who has been described as having one of the best brains and worst dispositions in the Navy, exhibited at this crisis a sweet reasonableness that brought the Army Air Force around to his point of view. He persuaded the general to send 60% of his planes to the 2 western bases where they could support the naval forces in the defence of Dutch Harbour. So 21 P-40Es and 14 bombers were flown up to Cold Bay, 12 P-40S to Otter Point, Umnak. These were radar-equipped, which made operation in fog practicable, but the pilots were not well trained in flying over water, and they had no time to become familiar with Aleutian terrain and weather before being called upon to fight. Daily overnight search flights were begun about the 28th of May from the 3 westernmost airfields and tenders to a distance of 400 miles, and from Kodiak to a distance of 700 miles. Admiral Theobald's effort to have more PBYs sent up from the west coast were unavailing until the 7th of June, when the operation was practically over. The 20 small cutters and converted fishing vessels were to be deployed as picket ships, both on the Pacific and Bering Sea approaches to Dutch Harbour, and our chart shows where they should have been on the 3rd of June. But several were too far away to get there in time, and others were too weak to hold station long enough to intercept the enemy. All these arrangements were worked out and decided by Admiral Theobald at Kodiak during the last 4 days of May. On the 1st of June, the Admiral departed Kodiak in cruiser Nashville and made rendezvous with the rest of his main body,